Hey guys, welcome back to another very exciting tutorial here at the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. My name is Jesus Ramirez. You can find me on Twitter at JRFromPTC. In this tutorial, we're going to take a daytime photograph and turn it into a rainy night scene. We'll start out with a photograph I took of my car, and we'll add a motion blur filter to create the illusion of motion. Then we'll start adding various adjustment layers to make it look as if this photograph was taken at night. I'll also show you how to add very accurate lens flares using the Precise Flare Center, which helps you position lens flares exactly in the place that you want. Then I'll show you how to create realistic looking rain using patterns and layer styles. And we'll then finish off the effect by adding some reflections and other details. This is a very versatile technique that you can apply to other images. For example, this image here, where I use exactly the same technique I'm about to show you. All I had to do was just make a few slight adjustments and I got the effect you see here. If you want to follow along, feel free to download the tutorial files from my website, PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. There's a link right below this video. If you're using your own image, keep in mind that your settings may be different than mine, but that's okay. All you need to do is make the appropriate adjustments so everything looks fine on your composition. And one quick note before we get started, I want to let you guys know that I'm now publishing my Photoshop tip of the day on LinkedIn and on Pinterest. The address to my LinkedIn profile is linkedin.com/company Photoshop-training-channel. When you get there, you can click on the yellow button on the top right, and you'll start receiving all my tips of the day on your LinkedIn feed. Also, if you're a Pinterest user, you can follow me there as well. Pinterest.com/PTCpins. And when you get to my profile, you'll see the different boards that I have, and one of those boards is the tip of the day, where I post a new Photoshop tip every single day. And I would also recommend creating a Photoshop tips board of your own, where you can repin any of the tips of the day that you like, and you can have easy access for future reference. And of course, the Photoshop tip of the day is still being posted on my Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus profiles. I want to thank you in advance for taking the time to follow PTC on those social networks. So let's get back to the tutorial. Okay, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is duplicate the background layer. So I'm going to select it and press Ctrl J, Command J on the Mac to duplicate it. I'm going to rename the layer by double clicking on the name and typing in the word car. Press Enter. Then I'm going to right click on it and convert it into a smart object. Now that I have a smart object, I can go ahead and apply a smart filter. So I'm going to go into the filter menu and choose blur, radial blur. I'm going to select zoom, best, amount of 10, and I'm just going to click and drag and move it up to the top left corner. So we want to create the illusion that there's motion coming from the street. So I'm going to press OK. Okay, and that looks pretty good. It sort of looks like the car is moving in our direction. What we're going to do now is we're going to click on the Smart Filter Mask, this little white rectangle here. And this works just like any other layer mask. So we can paint with the brush tool using black to hide the effect, or you can paint with white to reveal. I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-Z, Command-Option-Z to undo. So we're going to just paint with black around the car to not make it completely blurry, just the front of it and maybe part of the windshield, like so. Something like that. So now it looks like there's some motion and some speed in the image. I'm going to click on this arrow here just to hide the smart object so we have a little more room in the layers panel. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. And this is to make this look as if it were a night scene. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on brightness and just bring the brightness all the way down, all the way to -150. Then I'm going to click on the contrast and I'm going to add some contrast here, maybe 59 or so. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the layer mask, select the brush tool, paint with black, and I'm going to paint around the front of the car where I think the light would be. So later on in this tutorial, we're going to add some lights to the headlights. So I sort of need to keep this area bright. I can press X on the keyboard to switch to my background color, which is white, and I can sort of bring in some of the shadows back in the areas on the side here, and maybe here too as well. I'm going to press X again to switch to black as my background color, and I'm just going to paint here. And you know what, I think I went too bright, so I'm just going to switch those to paint with white. And something like that should work. Now I'm going to add another adjustment layer. This time it's going to be a color lookup adjustment layer, and I'm going to choose the night from day option here. And it's going to make everything look bluish, which is okay for now. And I'm just going to bring the opacity on this down just a little bit, maybe at about 75%. I'm going to add another adjustment layer. This time it's going to be a black and white adjustment layer. This is just to take some of the saturation off our scene here, since at night there's not that many bright colors, and I don't really like that strong of a blue hue on the entire image. So this is going to help me desaturate it a little bit. So I'm going to bring down the opacity to about 35%. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to call it headlights, and this is going to be the layer where I'm going to paint the lights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my brush tool, have a soft brush selected as you can see, and I'm going to choose white as my foreground color. I'm going to reduce the size of my brush, and I'm just going to paint here in the lights and just make a few dots like you see there. I'm going to make one down here and another one here. So that's going to be part of our light. So that is just essentially the brightness of the light. What we're going to do now is we're going to create some flares, because if we were taking a photograph of this, we would probably see a flare. So let's take care of that. I'm going to add another layer. This time I'm going to fill it with 50% gray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift and Backspace to bring up the fill menu, or you can go to Edit, Fill, and for contents use 50% gray and press OK. And that's going to fill the layer up with 50% gray. And what you can do now is set the blending mode to linear light, which is going to make it go invisible. So now if we were to add a lens flare, you would see the background and the lens flare. So you would choose a spot for a lens flare, press OK, and we will have our lens flare. So now we want to make sure that the lens flare is coming out of the lights here. So this is actually going to be for the left light. So I'll just type in left light, and I'll duplicate the layer, Control J, Command J on the Mac, and I'll call this one right light. Okay, so the one for the left light, we gotta make sure that the lens flare is coming right out of the spot. So how do we do that? One of the things we can do is use the Precise Flare Center. So what that is within this preview window, if you hold Alt click or Option on the Mac, you will open up this Precise Lens Flare Center, and you can set the X and Y coordinates to where you want the lens flare to be. When you input the numbers here, press OK, and it's going to create the flare. So where do we get those numbers from so that we can get a precise lens flare here? Well, you can use the Move tool, and you can also use the Info panel here. And notice that when I move my cursor around, and by the way, you don't have to use the Move tool, you can use any tool really, it doesn't matter what tool you have selected. I just used the Move tool, so I didn't really do anything else that I wasn't intending. But anyway, so if I move this around and hover over this area here where I want the light, you'll notice the X and Y coordinates here. So if I hover right over them, you'll see that around this spot here is 379 and 459. So you can go back into the filter menu, choose Render, Lens Flare, hit Alt, click, or Option on the Mac, and you can enter those numbers here. So for X, we can enter 379. For Y, we can enter 459. Press OK, and press OK again, and now our lens flare is exactly in that spot. Then, if this is too bright, we can bring the opacity down to something else, maybe like 50% or 44%, something like that. But anyway, so that's how you will go about that. And you know what? I just realized that I created the lens flare in the right light layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press Control Alt Z to undo. And I'm going to select the left light, go to Filter, Lens Flare. You can just press Control F, Command F on the Mac to redo the last lens flare. and then it's going to create it on the layer that we wanted, on the left light layer. And I'm going to bring down the opacity down again to 45%. Now I'm going to click on the right light layer. I'm going to hover over this area here, since this is where I want my X and Y coordinates. And if you see here on the side, we're looking at the coordinates of 866 and 459. So I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Lens Flare, Alt, click to bring up the precise flare center, and we'll type in the numbers 866 and 459. Press OK, and we have our new lens flare here. Now that one might be a little too strong, stronger than the other one, of course, and we can just bring it down to the appropriate opacity here, whatever you think works. So for me, it's going to be somewhere around, I guess 45% will work for this one too. And I actually kind of like the other little flare here at the bottom. So these are going to be my lens flares for this particular image. So I'm going to take all these, I'm going to take these 3 layers and put them in one group. So I'm going to click on the one at the top, Shift, click on the one on the bottom to select all, press Control G, Command G on the Mac, and I'm just going to call this group Flares. And it's always good to save, so I'm going to press Control S to save, Command S on the Mac. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add some fog here on the light, because if it's night and it's raining, you might be able to see some fog, some dust, some particles in the air because the light is shining on them. So why don't we do that? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new group right below the flares group here, and I'm just going to call this group Fog, and I'm going to add a layer on that group. So I'm just going to click on the new layer icon, and I'm going to call this layer Clouds, because we're just going to use the Render Clouds filter for this. So now that I have that selected, I'm going to go to Filter, Render Clouds, and this is going to help us create that fog. I'm going to click on the new layer mask icon to create a layer mask on that clouds layer, and I'm actually going to apply the same filter on the layer mask. So let me show you what that's going to do. Filter, Clouds. And what that does is it creates randomness in the layer mask, so there's more transparency. Another thing we can do is click on the fog group, add a layer mask, but I'm going to hold Alt, that's Option on the Mac, and it's going to create a black layer mask, which is going to hide everything. Now if I click on my brush tool, select a soft brush like this one here, increase the size maybe to something bigger, maybe around 350 pixels or so, you can sort of start painting in some of that fog, as you can see here. And I'm just clicking just in these areas here, so you can sort of see that these light beams are reflecting that fog. And I can also, of course, bring the opacity down to sort of match the scene a little bit better, so maybe something like that. So another thing I'm going to do is, just to keep things a little more organized, I'm just going to select these 3 layers, adjustment layers. I'm going to press Control G, Command G on the Mac, and I'm just going to call this group Adjustments. And again, that's to be a little more organized, and we can turn things on and off as we see fit. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to create the actual rain. So to do that, I'm going to show you a technique that you probably haven't seen before. Usually what people do when they want to create rain is use the noise filter, but we're not going to do that here. We're going to use something else, and I'm going to try to create some depth on the rain to try to make it more realistic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to fill that layer with black or white. It doesn't really matter what color you use. Then go to Filter, Render, Fibers, and we're going to use the Fibers filter for this. So variance, set it up to 50, strength to about 59. Press OK, and it's going to create this random effect you see here. Then go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur, and a motion blur of 90 degrees and distance about 169, and it's going to create the effect you see here. Then press OK. So we're going to make a pattern out of this, so we're going to make sure that there's no seams. So if I go to Filter, Other, Offset, we can offset this image, and if we offset it vertically, you'll see the seam in this image. So we got to get rid of that. So I'm just going to press OK, click on the rectangular marquee tool, and set the feather to about 20 pixels, and make a selection around that seam there. Then if you go to Filter, Blur, motion blur, you can see how that gets rid of that. And I gotta play with the distance just to make sure that it really gets rid of it and it doesn't make any other lines or anything else over here. And I think that's gonna work. So I'm gonna press OK, Command D, to deselect. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go into Image, Adjustments, Curves, and I'm just gonna make a curve here like so, and it's gonna start creating these lines that sort of look like rain, as you can see there. And I don't need too many of them, I just need just a few, something like that. So I'm gonna press OK, and I'm gonna zoom in just to see. And you know what, my blur wasn't that good because it created these long lines here that I'm not liking too much. So the way I'm gonna fix that is by grabbing the clone stamp tool, and I'm just gonna clone in more random lines in there like so. And I think that works. Maybe add a couple here like so. And you know what, this is actually way too many lines, so we might need less. So I'm gonna go to Image, Adjustment, Curves, and sort of hide and get rid of some lines by making the image darker. So maybe something like that. I'm gonna press OK again. So this is gonna be our rain. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna create a new layer. I'm gonna go into my channels panel, and I'm gonna control click on any one of these channels. They're all the same. So if I click on the red channel, control click on the icon of the channel here, but it's gonna give me a warning. This warning is telling me that you're not gonna see the marching ants because no pixel is more than 50% selected, and that's okay. If we go back into the layers panel and the new layer that we created, I can fill that layer with white holding Alt and backspace, since that's my foreground color. Or you can go to Edit, Fill, and use white and press OK. So we disable layer 1, you'll see the raindrops. But we're not done yet. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this rain texture layer, and I'm going to right click on it, select Duplicate Layer, and my destination is going to be a new document. So press OK. Then I'm going to go into Edit, Define Pattern, and we can name this pattern whatever we want. So I'm going to name this pattern Rain 1. Press OK. And that's all we need to do with this here. We can just delete it and we won't be needing it anymore. So now, if I disable this rain texture here, create a new layer, fill it with whatever color I want, for example, black. Oh, and by the way, I actually did a black fill, but it filled in those lines. And the reason it did that is because we still have our channel selected. I forgot to deselect that. So it just filled those pixels. And remember, that warning told us that we were not going to be able to see the selection. So that's why we can't see the marching ants. So that's okay. All I need to do is press Control D to deselect, and then fill with black again. And now we have a black layer. With this black layer, I can double click on it to bring up the layer style window, and I can select pattern overlay. If I select the very last pattern here, this is actually the rain pattern that we created, this one right here, the last one. And I can go into the blending options, fill opacity, bring the fill all the way down to 0, and you'll see the lines there. Let me close this for a moment, and if I zoom in, you'll see the rain here. Now, one of the things that we can do with this rain is we can increase the scale to make it look like there's rain closer to us, or we can decrease the scale to make it seem as if the rain is further away. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a bunch of these layers, and some of them are going to be further away, while others are going to be way close to us, maybe like this close. And it's really going to create an illusion of depth, and it's going to make the scene much more realistic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call this middle, because this is going to be the rain that's sort of in the middle, not too far, not too close. I'm going to duplicate the layer by pressing Ctrl J, and I'm going to click on pattern overlay, and I'm going to decrease the scale just a little bit. And by the way, you can move the rain around if you want to sort of move it around to a different spot for whatever reason. Anyway, so I brought the scale down to 75%. I'm going to press OK, and it's going to be middle, and I'll just call this middle far. And I'm going to create another duplicate of this layer, Control J, Command J on the Mac, and I'll call this middle furthest. And I'm going to set this to about 50%. So all these layers are sort of in the middle, but they're not really the same height and width and all of that. So it sort of creates more depth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the same thing for the layers that are further in the back. So I'm just going to duplicate the one that's up here. I'm going to press Ctrl J to duplicate it, and I'm going to call this layer back. Double click on it, and I'm going to set it to 25%. Duplicate that. Call it back far, and bring it to about 20%, or actually let's make it 17. And then we duplicate that one again, and we called it furthest. And I'm just going to make that 10%. So now we have a lot of depth in this image. And I know it looks like a whole bunch of lines now, but we're going to fix that in a moment. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate the middle one, press Ctrl J, bring the duplicate down, and I'm just going to call this one front. And I'm just going to increase the scale. I'm going to make a duplicate out of that. Front, and I'm just going to put this one close, call it close. And increase the scale, maybe move it around a little bit, see where it looks better. And I'll duplicate this one more time, and I'll call it front closest. And of course I'm going to increase the scale a lot on this guy, so something like that. So now we have the rain coming down. What I'm going to do now is zoom out, and I'm going to select all these layers that we created. I'm going to put them in one group, press Ctrl G. I'm going to call this group rain. I'm going to press Ctrl T to transform, and I'm going to increase the scale of these layers right about there. Or actually, you know what? Maybe even more than that. Actually, I need to increase the height more than anything else. I'm just going to increase the height. And by the way, I'm holding Alt as I'm making these changes to constrain the scaling to the middle there. All right, so now that I increased the size of those layers, I'm going to go ahead and right-click on them. And I'm going to rasterize the layers so they're just pixels. So if I select them all, I can right-click on them, rasterize layers, and they're no longer layer styles. Now they're just pixels. And the reason we're doing that is because I'm going to click and drag on the eyes there to hide them, and we're only dealing with one layer at a time. So I'm going to zoom in, and you can barely see this layer, and that's okay. Those are the raindrops that are further away, and I can actually add a blur to that. So I'm going to go to blur, blur. It's going to give it a faint blur, and that's okay. And you know what? This layer is fine. Maybe we'll rotate it a little bit. So I'm going to press Ctrl T, and just do a slight rotation on that. I'm going to open up the next layer, and I'll add the same blur to this one. Actually, you know what? Maybe this one needs more blur. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and see what blur works the best. Maybe 0.3 pixels, something like that. I'll zoom out, press Ctrl T, and I'll also rotate this layer in the same direction, but give it more of a rotation. Because drops just don't fall straight down from the sky. They usually come out of an angle, so we're trying to duplicate that here. And I'm just going to keep doing that same technique over and over again until I'm done with all the layers. So I'm just going to do it a little bit faster just so you can see how that works. And press Ctrl T to transform, rotate it. And by the way, if you're zoomed in and you click on a layer and you press Ctrl T and you can't see the handles, you can press Ctrl 0, Command 0 on the Mac, and it zooms you out to the bird's eye view, and you can see the entire bounding box. So you can try that. So maybe that one has a little more than the others. Press Enter. Control T, Command T on the Mac, and rotate this one just a little bit. Maybe these front ones are rotated even more than the others. Something like that. So you see how the rain is now starting to look just a little bit more realistic. It looks like there's some depth to it. And some of these guys need some blur, so I'm just going to blur them now. And this is sort of the part that takes the longest, but I think it gives you great results. And And actually that last one was a little too much of a blur, so I'm just going to go filter blur and just do a blur more, and that should be okay. And I can do another blur more for this one. And another blur more for this one. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is double click on the group to bring up the layer styles for the group. And by the way, if you have an older version of Photoshop, you won't be able to do this. So what you need to do is convert it into a smart object and then double click on the layer. But anyway, so once the layer style comes up, you can select the blend if options, and in the underline layer section you can click and drag this over to the right. And what that does is that hides the raindrops from the darkest areas of your image. And if you look at a photograph of rain at night, the raindrops don't usually show up in the dark areas. They only show up in areas where there's light shining through them. So that's sort of what we're trying to accomplish here. So sort of bringing this in like so, and the raindrops disappear over here, but you can see them where the light is shining. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is add a layer mask and do what we did before. Go to filter, render, clouds, and it really hides a lot of those drops, but that's okay. We don't want the drops to be too noticeable. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate the group, press Ctrl J, and this time I'm just going to fill the layer mask with black. And with my brush tool, I'm going to paint with white in the areas where I really want the raindrops to show, like in this area here. So you can see the difference that makes. So these are sort of the headlights making the rain in front of it shine like so. And if it's too strong, you can always bring the opacity down to 0 and then go up and find a spot that you're happy with. Okay, so now that we've created the rain, we're going to do one other thing. We're going to start working on the road here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer, fill it with black, and I'm going to double click on it to bring up the layer style options. Click on pattern overlay and select that same rain pattern we were working with before. The scale of it will be okay at 100%, so I'm just going to press OK. And I'm going to convert this. And oh, actually I forgot to bring in the fill opacity, but that's okay, I can do that from here. So I'm going to bring the fill opacity to 0, and I'm going to convert it into a rasterized layer. And actually, so you can see what I'm doing, I'm just going to hide everything else. And I have this layer here. I'm going to press Ctrl T to transform, and actually I'm going to zoom out just so you can see better. And I'm going to right click on it and select distort. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to match this layer onto the road here. So I'm just going to sort of place it where I think would work. And actually just move this to the right. And I'm trying to match that line there on the sidewalk, and I'll try to do the same thing on this side. Something like that. Now if I right click on it and select scale, I can scale it forward and scale it backwards, and this is what I want. Maybe scale this one back a little bit further. What I'm really trying to create is these lines on the street there. I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to add a layer mask, and I'm just going to quickly hide by painting with black on that layer mask the lines that go on top of the car. And you know, this the scene is dark, so we don't have to be too perfect when creating this mask, but I just don't want any of those obvious lines right on the car. So all I wanted was to create these lines on the road that help us sell the effect of speed on the road. Anyway, so I'm going to turn on the other layers, and you can see sort of what we did there. I'll call this road lines, just so you know what it is. So I'm going to select this road lines layer and bring it over and put it on top of the car here. If the lines are too strong for you, you can of course bring down the opacity. Actually, we're in the part of the tutorial where a lot of these things may not look right to you. So what you might want to do is you might want to start playing with the different groups and layers that you have. For example, I think this fog is way too dark, so I might bring that down. This brightness layer is a little too light for me, so what I'm going to do is I think it's because of the color lookup, so I might increase the color lookup actually all the way to 100% now that I see it here. So yeah, take time to go through your image and make things darker or lighter, or do the things that you need to do to make it look good. And one other thing that I'm going to do to this layer to try to sell the illusion of rain at night is create a reflection of the car. So I'm just going to quickly select the car using the lasso tool, And actually I'm going to hold shift and draw the side mirrors here, and select the car and press Ctrl J, Command J to duplicate. Then I'm going to press Ctrl T to transform, and I'm just going to rotate that, and I'm going to move that down. And if you need to match the angle of your car or subject or whatever it is that you're using, you can try using the warp tool by right clicking on the layer and sort of match it better this way, something like that. Press enter when you're done. And since it's a reflection, you know what, I just realized that it's still not looking right. So I'm going to press Control T again, Command T, choose warp, and then move this over to the right. So I kind of want to match the car on top there. So maybe something like that. And this is going to be okay for this tutorial. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur, and I'm going to bring the blur down a little bit. So maybe something like that. Press OK. And what I'm going to do now is add a new layer, paint with white, and I'm just going to paint some white dots here, which obviously represent the car lights there. I'm going to turn on the other layers once again. And actually, maybe I can move this one above the adjustment layers and bring down the opacity if I have to. Something like that. So now we have the reflection of the car, and we have the lights on the ground. And you know what, now that I look at it, I think the lights may need the same motion blur, so I'm just going to apply it a couple times on the lights there. And maybe just keep doing it. And you can actually keep pressing Control F until you're happy with it. So maybe something like that. I'll bring the opacity back up. So that's more or less what it's going to look like. And that's it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I would recommend that you keep playing around with your image if you want to make it a little more realistic. For example, you can add some raindrops hitting the car, perhaps the pavement. Also, if you're using a different image, remember that some of the settings that I use for the adjustment layers may not work for your image, so play around with those. You may need to add more adjustment layers, or you may need to add less. It all depends on the image that you have. Also, the same way we created this rain effect could be used to create snow. You just have to play around with the filters just a little bit more. And by the way, if anyone's thinking that this is not very realistic because nobody's driving that car, well, how about if I add one of these? If you're familiar with the old show Knight Rider, then you know what this is all about. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. And head over to my website, photoshoptrainingchannel.com, where you can subscribe to my newsletter, where you'll get access to subscriber-only tutorials and an email notification every time a new tutorial comes out. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again next time.